What's the crack? I wanted to do a little clip here about science, scientific thinking, what science is, what science isn't, and what we need to be wary of when politicians or public influencers say follow the science, and this kind of rhetoric as if science is one thing that is like almost like a kind of revealed truth or dogma. So first of all, what's really important to understand about science is that it is, in its foundation, science is the study of nature at its base, right? But the thing about studying nature is that infinite mystery underpins it. What I mean by that is, we can never know, even if we figure out as a species, let's say, some unified laws of physics that reconcile Einstein's general relativity at the big level with quantum mechanics at the very, very small level, and plugs a whole lot of other gaps and reconciles all the other laws, even if that becomes possible at some point, where there's some kind of a unified theory, there's still always the possibility of unknown knowledge. There's always the possibility of a thing before the thing. There's always the possibility that knowledge exists outside of our current understanding. Especially from a human perspective, because no matter what we learn about the universe within which we are part, or of which we are part and within which we reside, we're still trying to read the label from inside in the jar, right? So I wanted to make that very clear. At the basis, there's a beautiful line by Karl that I've been using in an essay I've been writing recently on free speech. And it says something along the lines of, while we may vary greatly in the little bits that we know, we are all equal in our infinite ignorance. And I buy that, because there is an incomprehensible asymmetry in terms of knowledge between whatever information I may have or knowledge I may have and all possible knowledge within the entire universe. Between all possible knowledge that has ever been known, could ever be known, has ever any information from which knowledge could be generated that has existed prior to human existence, and after humans finish, whatever else will be, that there is an asymmetry there between a single human and all possible knowledge. And furthermore, on a human limitation perspective, there isn't anything that I know of that's built into the laws of physics that basically says that a human brain is capable of understanding anything within the universe. So there may very well be knowledge that if a human, or information that if a human was able to come across, it might not be able to actually understand. Like, this isn't say that eventually humans wouldn't be able to understand it if you were to come across or develop some kind of computation technology to be able to actually grapple with things that we at our meat brain or our meat computer can't navigate, but there's still a limitation or potential. But anyway, that asymmetry between a single person and all possible knowledge, I call the axiom of the infinite unknown. Because an axiom is a thing you accept as a basic postulate upon which you build future arguments. So with regards to knowledge, there is the fundamental thing underneath every single opinion about any aspect of reality is infinite ignorance. So that doesn't mean that it's a futile endeavour to try and understand nature, of course, because let me give you an example. Einstein's general relativity, built on what he basically presented in 1915 to the Prussian Academy of Sciences, after spending 7 or 8 years trying to reconcile gravity with his special relativity that he presented in 1905, that ended up becoming a more useful and better predictive descriptor of the workings of gravity and the movement of large objects in space than Newtonian mechanics. Like, I'm not an expert in the physics of it by any means, but the history of it serves as a fascinating example. Where basically, Newtonian mechanics was around for a few hundred years. It was the best description, but there was some holes in it. And Einstein's basically work was able to do what Newton's work could do, plus some extra stuff. And it basically ended up, for example, being used. General relativity went on to predict, for example, presented in 1915, 100 years later in 2015, it managed to, so it was used to predict the existence of what were called gravitational waves. that were theoretically possible but had never been discovered. And in 2015, poetically enough, 100 years afterwards, gravitational waves are detected for the first time by an organisation called LIGO, a group of scientists. Then a research group called LIGO. And then it also predicted the existence of what would be called black holes. So prior to 2009, which were then actually photographed for the first time ever in April 2019. Poetically enough, again, 100 years after the 1919 eclipse pictures that were taken by the two different expedition groups by Sir Arthur Eddington to go and investigate Einstein's work in regards to taking a picture of this, what was called a redshift. I think it was called a redshift of the light spectrum or something. I can't remember the exact description. But anyway, 1919, there was a photo of an eclipse taken, and they were looking at the distance of a particular star to the sun. I've written about this on Sigma Nutrition. If you wanted to go and have a look at the website, there's an article called Intellectually Lost. It's basically, Are You Really Science-Based? Part 3. Wires Crossed and Intellectually Lost. And I use Einstein, this whole history of kind of Einstein's GR and how it ended up overcoming Newtonian mechanics in that. So basically, Einstein, an example, and the reason I used it, that Einstein history in particular, is because even though infinite ignorance underpins everything that we know about any aspect of nature, or this external reality within which my subjective experience seems to be occurring, there is still more or less accurate ways of understanding it and trying to understand it and getting less wrong. So it seems to be, because Einstein's work can do what Newton's work could do, with an extra bit of stuff as well, then it's a less wrong description of reality. It doesn't mean that Newton was wrong. It means that Einstein is less wrong than him. So it doesn't, sorry, you know what I'm saying basically. So it's not that Einstein is true, it's true, it's just less wrong than Newton. Because we're only ever getting less wrong. There's no such thing as an ultimate truth. You know, it doesn't exist. Like, because we'll never know if we've, as I said at the very beginning, a couple of minutes ago, even if we can develop some kind of unified laws of physics, we'll never know if there's anything else outside of those. There's always the possibility for unknown knowledge. So, or unknowledge, let's say. So, with that, when it comes to science, another thing that's worth keeping in mind, right, is there is two things that need to be kept in tension in our own minds. The first is that this is how the scientific method works, actually. I'll describe this first. So the scientific method, basically, is so powerful because it helps us to counter our own biases. So we have these, as humans, we're these finite, fallible, limited, irrational primates. And we have these biases that get in our way with regards to understanding nature. Biases would include things like confirmation bias, where it feels nice, it feels better to find evidence to support what we already think than it does to find evidence to question what it is, to question our pre-existing viewpoints. We like to feel right. I could go into this various potential theories around why that might be the case or whatever, but regardless, we like to feel right. We don't like to feel like our models of the world or models of certain components of culture or society or nature or whatever are being questioned. The second component, another bias would be a thing called group normative conformity, is what I kind of think of it as. Another way of thinking about it is like group conformity, tribal conformity, where we like to feel like we belong and we want to kind of like fit in. We don't want to be going against the grain. And that would have served a very useful evolutionary function, because a human that was excommunicated from a group stood very little chance of surviving. And even if that individual human could survive, if it's by itself, its genes aren't getting passed on because that human isn't breeding. So we are the descendants of people who were able to toe a line sufficiently to be able to be accepted within groups, kept within groups, sufficiently enough to be able to get their genes far enough into the future for us to exist here and now. And a certain amount, so like there's an understanding as to why our brains are tilted towards wanting to fit in and not wanting to be kicked out of groups and not wanting to question the group narrative. So there's an example of two certain biases that I think play a key role, that science plays a key role, the scientific method plays a key role in getting us to counter. So here's a really simple breakdown of how the scientific method works as it relates to orientating towards being less wrong. Which is all we can ever do, is try and get less wrong, because we'll never find truth. Ultimate truth. So, I'll use Popperian language by the man I referenced earlier on, Karl Popper. So, he had this concept of, he wrote it in his book of essays called Conjectures and Refutations. And a conjecture is basically an opinion formed with incomplete knowledge. So, because humans are only ever generating any opinion about any aspect of nature or reality with incomplete knowledge, all we're ever doing is generating conjectures. Then the refutation bit. So a refutation is an attempt to find where something is wrong, to disconfirm it, to disprove it, to take a sledgehammer to it. But we don't just do that with any ideas. Like, certain ideas aren't even worth trying to find out where they're wrong, because the idea is too variable. So this is where I'll take David Doidge, who's a physicist in Oxford, quantum computation kind of pioneer, and he wrote this beautiful book called The Beginning of Infinity, where in it he described good explanations. So what makes an explanation good is if it's of low explanatory variability. So what a way of describing that is like, the example he used in the book, and I've talked about this in a previous video, was the heliocentric model of our solar system. There aren't ways of messing with the variables and still being able to explain why winter happens or why the seasons change on Earth. But if you took something like the Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone, which basically involves Persephone being captured by Hades and brought to hell, and then eventually gets released, and the agreement that Persephone swallows this magic seed that then causes her to come back for a conjugal visit to hell every kind of autumn or winter, and then Demeter gets sad, and then it gets cold in the wintertime because Demeter is sad. That's the kind of the myth. But the problem with that is, as a description of when winter happens, it's a poor, high variability explanation, because we could just say, well, maybe Persephone is sad when she's in hell and that's why it gets cold. Or maybe when Hades is having sex with Persephone, then the world gets cold when Hades is having sex. Like, you could just fuck around with any of the variables and winter still happens. So then it's a bad explanation. So we don't need to try and falsify it because it's a high variability explanation. Whereas the heliocentric model is, you can't change any of the variables around the wobble of the Earth or the path that it takes, and so you can't mess around with the variables and still explain winter time. So, or the seasonal change on Earth. So then it's worth actually experimenting on. So this is the second kind of component. There's another layer to add in here is the role of scientific consensus versus innovation. So if there are fields, like I don't understand, I can't do the mathematics or the physics to explain the heliocentric model and map it out for someone. So because I can't explain it, the wisest thing for me to do is to just defer to consensus, because it's less likely to be wrong if there's loads of other minds that are also kind of agreeing on it, because there isn't any way for me to separate wheat from chaff. Whereas if it's an area that I'm more aware of, then I'm more well able to separate wheat from chaff, and to be able to potentially see when innovation is after happening, even if it occurs at the expense of an idea that I previously held to be the least wrong reflection of reality. So we need to hold those things in tension, basically, because every innovation in a creative sense as it relates to the generation of scientific knowledge occurs as a result of heresy. So every scientific innovation is a heresy of one against the consensus. The same way that Einstein was. Like the GPS on my phone that allows me to find my way around a new city or a countryside, or to get to a new address of a friend's house I haven't been to before, whatever. That GPS only works because of Einstein's general relativity. If it wasn't for GR, my GPS, I think the GPS ends up being wrong, because time, GR basically shows that general relativity highlights that time moves differently in space. So where the satellites are, time moves differently there than it does on the surface of the Earth, because the gravity is different. So if the adjustment wasn't made in the clocks between the clocks in the satellites out in space and the clocks on Earth, then my GPS could be wrong 10 or 11 kilometers a day, I think it is. And as I said, I'm not an expert in the actual physics of it, so I can't explain it at any more high resolution, but or any more high resolution than that. But that's basically the way that it seems to play out. So the GPS works as a result of Einstein's heresy in 1915 to present his general relativity at the Prussian Academy of Sciences in counter to hundreds of years old consensus behind Newtonian mechanics. So, and you can take that across all different fields. So scientific innovation is heresy. That's the way of thinking about it. So then with all this COVID stuff that's going on and this kind of sense making that's taking place, we have to hold those things in tension, which is it is possible at any moment in time for the consensus opinion on something to be the most likely option if it's something that we're very unaware of, because there's loads of minds contributing to it, and who are we to separate wheat from chaff? But it's also possible, just like those hundreds of years of physicists who supported Newtonian work and then thought that Einstein was wrong when he first came out with general relativity, that actually, the heretic can sometimes be right, because that's how innovation has always happened, is heresy. So just like, for example, there's a fascinating flip-flop that's after occurring in recent weeks with the lab leak hypothesis, where the kind of mass consensus in most of the kind of standard media channels and newspapers and the kind of more political elites or whatever, and that even sounds kind of conspiracy theorist to even call them elites, but you know what I mean, was that the lab leak hypothesis was wrong, it was incorrect. There was journal articles by this guy Chris Masterjohn and then this Peter Daszak guy who published these papers in statement papers in really high, really reputable research journals. But then there was people that were also pushing back against the zoonotic origin, kind of natural origin idea. And examples include Yuri Deegan, who published an article, it was either April or May in 2020, that early, who was highlighting, do you know what, there's some fishy stuff going on here. This looks like it could be from a lab. And put a big body of evidence behind it. Brett Weinstein is another person, Dark Horse podcast, evolutionary biologist, who had Yuri Deegan on his podcast in June of 2020, and then went on Joe Rogan later that month to talk about the lab leak hypothesis as well. One of the things he talked about, as well as a number of other really interesting topics. And then it built from there, where there was other people talking about it. This guy Josh Rogan is a Washington Post writer, talked about it extensively on Rogan a couple of months ago, and then wrote a bit of his new book, I believe, about it as well. There was an article by a really good piece in the New York Magazine early 2020. There was another piece on Tablet Magazine by Dr. Norman Doidge called "A Plague on Both Our Houses," I think it's called. It's an excellent piece that compiled a load of the evidence and lab leak hypothesis. But all the while, if in the kind of mainstream sense-making apparatus, people who even mentioned the lab leak hypothesis were seen as automatically to be conspiracy theorists, kind of lumped in with it was all like the bracket over there, conspiracy theorist, you're lumped over there with the group of people who might as well be wearing tinfoil hats and talking about getting abducted and getting probes put up their arse by aliens. You know, you're over there with that group of people, the conspiracy theorist, just because you've pushed against the widely accepted narrative. And there's something really toxic about that, because it has turned out over the last 2 or 3 weeks that there's all of a sudden been a big flip, where now mainstream institutions, because the evidence has been, and nothing really new has come out in the last few weeks, it's just like, they're just all of a sudden, there's this mass decision to, let's try and come up with a reason to explain why we made such a mess of denying the lab leak hypothesis early on, in spite of the overwhelming evidence. So they're saying that, now serious people are talking about the lab leak hypothesis. Now they're saying things like, a topic that was formerly just in the realm of the conspiracy theorist is now open to discussion, and now this Biden is launching an investigation, and now it's suddenly okay to talk about. But the problem, of course, is that it was never not okay to talk about it from a scientific sense in terms of plausibility. Like, it was always a plausible option on the table. It had never been debunked. There was these ridiculous newspaper articles and media articles and people talking about the lab leak hypothesis being debunked, proven wrong, all this kind of stuff. That had never been the case. It had never been debunked ever. And the evidence hasn't changed in the last few weeks. There was a couple of new bits, but they're just like little sprinkles on the top of a cake that's already finished. So, but in terms of, I don't mean finished product, as in this is definitely the truth. Like, it still might turn out to be the case that there is a zoonotic origin. That still is a possibility, of course. I don't have a fucking notion. I don't have the skill set or the knowledge or the expertise in any of these domains. Virology, epidemiology, vaccines. I don't have any expertise in these areas. But what I do understand to a higher degree than I once did, I don't know what this understanding is like relative to other people, is that infinite ignorance is underneath every single one of our opinions at all times. So we need to be aware of that. And we also need to be aware that any innovation that has ever occurred is heresy against consensus. So there's always the possibility that no matter how strong the evidence we have, we're wrong. So we need to be very careful of how we present evidence, because what worries me greatly is this lab leak hypothesis, for example, serves to be such a because it was presented in such a dogmatic manner in an anti way, so that it was people who presented or proposed the lab leak hypothesis were automatically lumped in with Trump supporters or conspiracy theorists or both or whatever. And it was so aggressively gone after and so aggressively suppressed and shut down by people that we're supposed to trust to make sense of the world for us and to do so that we can do our normal jobs and live our careers and love our families and spend time with our friends, and then dip into these sense-making apparatuses like New York Times or Washington Post or whatever, and read articles, and hopefully, or the Guardian or the Spectator magazine or whatever. We're trying to hopefully make sense of the world, but we can't be specialists in everything. So the problem is, and I'm not lumping all those magazines in together, like they're all different. Like the Spectator is obviously different to the Guardian, for example. I'm not lumping them all in together. I'm just saying that they're an examples. We're trying to make sense of the world, and we're trying to rely on sense makers to do it for us, because we don't have infinite time to study every aspect in the highest resolution possible. But what worries me greatly is any time heresy is a thing. So any time that the consensus starts to crush heretical opinion, we are in trouble. Because we're decreasing the chances of actually getting less wrong, because we're shutting down potentially new hypotheses that could be more accurate than our own. And this is something that I'd love for more people to be aware of. And this lab leak hypothesis serves as an unbelievably useful example of the toxicity of consensus forced conformity. Where if it hadn't been for people who were willing to stick their head above the parapet and seek truth wherever it led, regardless of how it affected their reputations, regardless of how it affected their credibility amongst certain people, if people like Yuri Deegan and Brett Weinstein and Josh Rogan and Norman Doidge, if these people were unwilling to have the courage, or did not have the courage to be willing to stick their head above the parapet and say, this is where the evidence leads, and I'm willing to acknowledge this, even if it makes my life more uncomfortable, and even if it disenfranchises me, even if it wasn't for them, then the likelihood of us getting less wrong about the origins of this virus is so much lower, because it would have just been a whole load of sheep all falling into line. So basically, yeah, I wanted to just do a little rant on this, because this is such an unbelievably important topic. The world is only getting more complex. It's only getting more complex. The amount of information that's being generated, the amount of the information landscape, the complexity, the censorship that's taking place on tech platforms like Facebook, only at the end of May, made it okay to publish stuff in the lab leak hypothesis after instituting a ban on it. So you can, there's an article, like I might include a link to it here from The Guardian where they described it. That up until the 26th or 27th of May or whatever it was, towards the end of that month, if you had published something on Facebook about the lab leak hypothesis, you could get the post gets taken down. If you did it multiple times, you could lose your account. Who are Facebook to be the arbiters of truth? How are they to know what the truth of this is? How can they possibly take it on themselves and think that they are the truth czars? That it's up to them to decide what the truth is? Like, this is insane. This is an unbelievably complex situation. Infinite ignorance underpins every single one of our opinions about reality. So, we are in a situation where individual sense-making has never been more important because the world is only getting more complex. And our sense-making apparatus, the certain elements of it, not all of it, but the certain elements of it in what would be considered the mainstream media, that there's an element of the emperor being shown to have no clothes. Because and this lab leak hypothesis makes such an interesting light of that. Like, as I said, and this is without me making a claim as to the origins of the virus, because how the fuck could I know where this thing came from? I'm merely highlighting the failures at institutional levels and mainstream media levels, mainstream institutional levels, to acknowledge the fact that they could have been wrong, and part of that unwillingness to acknowledge they might have been wrong was also their suppression of nonconformist viewpoints, which all we need to do is ask Galileo Galilei how that went, or Giordano Bruno. Do you know? There is a massive danger as soon as we feel like we have found what truth is, as soon as we've latched onto a dogma and are unwilling to let that go, as soon as we stop trying to find out where we're wrong and we simply try and pile up evidence to support a preconceived bias that we hope to be right, or that we not even hope to be right, but we are full sure it's right. As soon as we are certain of anything other than the need to remain uncertain, we're fucked. So anyway, I'll finish on that note. Peace, and